Hello and welcome again to Seekers of Meaning, the podcast TV arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address. Thank you for joining us today in what promises to be a very, very interesting and fascinating and most likely very timely conversation. And for that end, we welcome Dr. Judith Smith to our program. Dr. Smith is the author of this very, very interesting and challenging book called Difficult. The subtitle is Mothering Challenging Adult Children Through Conflict and Change. Dr. Judith Smith. Welcome, Dr. Smith, to Seekers of Meaning. I hope you're well, and thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
This is a very challenging book, very interesting book, raising all kinds of very, very wild and timely and just sometimes disturbing issues. First of all, what was the motivation of writing this? I know you're in practice and PhD, MSW. Talk to me a little bit of what was that spark? I mean, was it on the LIE? You got the calling to say, I got to write this book?
Well, I was a child developmental researcher for many years. Starting in my 20s, I worked with famous psychoanalysts, observing mothers and babies, and that really became my academic work for about 15 or 20 years, really looking at how does mother's employment affect her children, looking at the first 3 years of life, which have been shown to be critical for child's development. And then I happened to get older.
It happens here.
Well, anyway, it happens, yeah. And my son got older and his friends got older. And some of them were having challenges. Some were just, streaming through. And I got curious. And I also switched into gerontology because in social work, there's a big push for us to be doing research with older people. So I was already in that world. And I became interested in what were gerontologists, what were they studying about older mothers and their adult children? And, you go on and...
you have a book.
Do your search. And I looked and I looked and I looked, and I was really shocked. This was like a black hole. The one finally I found Carl Pillemer, who's a human development, quite well known, a gerontologist. And he and his group use a longitudinal study that has older adults. And they were able to study older people and their adult children and what factors made them more depressed or happier about their adult kids. But they only had 4 questions in there that they tracked, use. But I think seeing the void, and I decided that this was the place for me to start doing research.
This subject comes up in so many of the workshops that we do, caregiving workshops, the new Jewish grandparenting workshop, even the end of life stuff, about that changed in the relationships of people, parents, grandparents with adult children. They're not 12 anymore. Even though sometimes we think, well, we can rush in and save them, when the reality is, they're adult. They're independent human beings. So this definition of challenging adult children, that's in this subtitle. Define challenging adult child.
Well, really, the book calls them difficult adult children. I coined the name difficult adult children, and it's really about difficult mothering. I only interviewed women. We can talk about that decision later on, but I spent 3 hours with every person over 2 periods listening to their stories of their trajectory of mothering, starting where their kids were very little and then really moving into adulthood. And the people who chose to speak to me, I recruited in senior centers and from social workers to find people, older people over 60, who had adult children who they were worried about, who they felt, and their worrying was affecting them. And I was surprised. I had no idea what people who would come to speak to me. It could have been someone who was upset that their kid didn't visit more often. Could have been somebody who was upset that their kid was marrying out of the faith. But in fact, the people who came to talk to me, who raised their hand or signed up were people who had adult children with serious mental illness or substance use disorder, primarily. And this was, and I didn't know. And then I got to know these people, and what they were all these moms were still very involved with their adult children, even if they had been abusive to them, even if they were now living on the street because the mother couldn't live with them anymore. The mother's heart was still with her son or daughter. She wanted the best for them, and she'd find some way to be connected. But this is a very difficult way to have to live as an older person and as a mother, to not be able to help your child, to not have a solution, to want to do whatever you can. And there, as you say, there's not an easy solution with all this if you've ever really troubled child. So I think the challenging is not being able to support yourself, which is caused by serious mental illness or substance use disorder. There are other, like I live in Manhattan in an apartment building, and I would tell my neighbors in the elevator what I was doing. There's interviewing mothers of difficult adult children, and they'd all say, interview me. Because raising an adult, parenting an adult child is hard, because actually we have two jobs as parents in our society. One is to launch our kids. We are successful if our kids are launched. And the data, like the Pillimer, shows if your kids are launched, if they're married, if they're working, parents are less depressed. They feel good about themselves. So if you fail in that job of launching your child, you feel bad about yourself and also worried about them. But our other job as parents is to be there when our kids are in crisis. So these are two things that go against each other. And I think that's one of the dilemmas that every parent of an adult child worries. How much do I give? Do we help them with the house? How much are we supposed to give? How much are we not supposed to?
One of the challenges that, again, as I was reading through the book, and this is one of the tensions that I'm convinced now as we get older that we all have to deal with, but it seems to be exacerbated as you point out in the book, as in this particular situation, that tension of what do we hold on to and what do we have to sometimes for our own safety and our own mental health let go of. Could you just talk about that? How in your research and in developing the book, did you come across people even verbalizing this? I have to hold on, but I need to let go of something. I just need to let go because it's dragging me down.
Oh, that's
really
what everybody was talking about in one way or the other. So I call it torn in two, in terms of I want to help him, but killing me. So one mom said, I met her, she had just come to a senior legal clinic to find out how she could evict her daughter, 50-year-old daughter, and her grandson, both who had bipolar disease. Because she had just gone to her doctor, who said her blood pressure was so high that she was really at risk for her life, and she had her stress. She knew the stress was living in her living room. There was her daughter and her 16-year-old grandson. It's a tiny apartment. So she said to me, I'm at a crossroads. What do I do? Do I throw them out? And I knew, but when she left me after our sessions, that she was not going to throw them out. I spoke to her several years later, and they did eventually move out. But she was really deciding my health or their safety. And that's a terrible decision to have to make.
And something, you mentioned, you're living in New York and close proximity, but did you also, I'm sure you did, the subject of mobility, how much more challenging is it in your research to deal with that parent who is attempting to parent or mother a difficult child who is living 1,000 miles away?
They were not specifically, I have more moms. I now run support groups, and many moms where kids will just disappear. So you're not really actively mothering. You may try to find one woman's daughter was living in the rural Wisconsin, and she would go out there every once in a while, and she found people she could call. I mean, I think people find ingenious ways to get eyes. You want eyes on your kids. So one woman, if she didn't see her daughter on Facebook, I mean, Facebook becomes a link where you can see if your kids are posting and if they're doing okay. And if she didn't see her kid was posting for a couple of weeks, she would call the food bank and the homeless shelter and say, this is a tiny town. Have you seen Susie? And they said, yeah, she was here last night. And then she could relax for a minute.
You mentioned in the earlier part of the book, and it's also carried through, this dichotomy of guilt versus shame, and a phrase that you use, mother shaming.
What
is
blame?
That? What is it?
That happens on many levels in our society. I mean, for people who have aggressive adolescents or adolescents who are taking drugs, many researchers have documented that when you go to get help, to say, my son's smoking too much pot, my son is doing this, the first reaction many people get is, what are you doing wrong? What's wrong with your parenting? You should be in a parenting class. And even in England, they had some laws for a while that if your adolescent was aggressive, you could be fined and you were sent to parenting classes. This idea that aggression can be internal and the kids can have their own problems, that's not just based on nurturing, and that the mother needs help with the kid, not her parenting. So that's the assumption. I mean, and my profession is partially to blame. You know, we have created a world where it's your mother, it's how you grew up, it's the world you were raised in. And I think, you know, I'm a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I have all that knowledge, but when I talk to older mothers, that's not where I'm thinking. I mean, they are in a dilemma that's way beyond nurturing, that it's when your kid has serious mental health problems or has a substance use disorder, this is beyond that you might not have been the perfect parent. And some people were not, in actuality, did things that one would say that was not right. But that does not lead to, X does not predict Y. And how many years should you pay the price for that you were a working mother or you did this or you did that?
Could you just comment on, because you're all of your life experience in the book and your practice, you alluded to before, those first 3 years, how important they are, the messages that are sent in, either literally or subliminally to a kid. But contrast that with the genetics. And how much does genetics play in some of this? Because, go ahead.
Are we talking about the first?
Yeah, we're talking. Yeah.
I mean, certainly healthcare plays a part. You know, if in poor neighborhoods where there's really a lot of maternal health problems around pregnancy, if your child is premature, it puts them at much higher risk for cognitive development, which makes it harder to form the bond between the mother and the baby. So, you know, I think health matters in terms of this. But I think all the work on the first 3 years, it's not genetics versus nurture. It's that the nurture helps the child, regardless if they have high intelligence or lower intelligence, have a sense of a stable base with the mother.
And that stable base, there's such family dysfunction. I don't know what that's even not the right word. Divorce rates. That is not necessarily, or is it, a predictor of an adolescent or young person who has to endure this growing up to be a, quote, difficult adult child, or is it?
I think having the secure base with one parent or a grandmother. The grandmother can be the secure base. Helps enormously when life stresses happen in adolescence or later life. But I don't think it's the lack of a good attachment in early life that leads to being a difficult child. I think serious mental illness and substance use disorder have biological determinants.
That's still your number two. That's the focus, obviously the focus of the book, but in your practice and experience, these are the two triggers, correct?
Yes. I mean, there are other, with the book out, and there was just a big article in the New York Times, I'm getting calls from mothers whose kids have autism, kids who have different kind of neurodiversity. There's the same challenges of being a mother to a kid who hasn't fit in and where they can find their place and the lack of services. But the people who are over 60 who are still worrying about this, who came to me, happen to be primarily people with mental health, kids with mental health challenges and substance challenges.
So you alluded to the role of the grandmother. I'd also include grandpops. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about the power and importance, and it seems to be growing, of the grandparent in sometimes being that link as opposed to the parent to the adult child. My sense is that grandparenting, we're certainly picking this up in some of our work, that the concept of the grandparent is changing, the impact, the involvement. Could you talk a little bit about how important that grandparenting relationship can be?
Right. And I think many older people are stepping in when their kids have drug problems and aren't able to parent, that the grandparent becomes the foster parent, becomes the kinship parent, and the mom might even lose parental rights, and the grandparents are there taking over. And then it becomes another whole, and there are many people who are writing this, a whole other separate level of conflict, because in some ways the kid views the grandparent as taking them away from their own parents. I mean, often when the parent comes to visit, once a month, or they get very angry at the grandparent. But clearly, many grandparents step in when their kids are not able to continue to parent. In my study, I had several, one mom, her 4 kids were launched, and her youngest son one day comes and knocks on the door and says, we just had a baby. We have a 1-year-old. We were living at my girlfriend's mother's house, and she just asked us to leave. Could we live here for a little while? And the grandmother said, of course, come, And she said to herself, he's a good boy. I mean, she really knew that he had been a handful growing up, but she was not, and there was a grandchild. So they moved in, and she had a tiny little house with outside porch. They had made an apartment. They moved in, and they didn't leave for 12 years, and they kept having more and more kids, and they kept invading her space, leaving the bathroom sopping wet, so she would be endangered. It turned into a nightmare. But she was in this mind of, how do I kick out my grandchildren? But her life was really at risk. And finally, her son was very savvy, was using the courts to try to get her evicted, because he somehow believed it was his house. And he had her sent to jail. She was in jail for a night for not letting him back in the house. And then finally, she realized she had to get him out. But I think this bind of whose needs take precedence, that you want to help your grandkids. Another grandmother I met, her son had a child and was living with his girlfriend or wife, and the woman wanted a divorce and accused him of strangling her and abuse. And therefore, he was losing the rights to the kids temporarily, and she was going to lose the rights for visitation. And she would not stand for this. She went to the court. She went to the court both to support her son and to make sure she saw her kids. She won. she got the visitation back because those kids were so important to her, and she knew how important she was in their life.
You touch on this issue of abuse, and you write about this in the book in very real terms. Let me quote, I think it's on page 121. You say, quote, "Most studies, but not all, have identified women as the most likely victims of elder abuse," unquote. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I would going to bet that a lot of people were not aware of that statistic.
Well, it's not only is the gender statistic important, I think knowing that what we call elder abuse, within family elder abuse, the main perpetrator is the adult child who is living at home and has serious mental health or substance use challenges. So you can imagine that you bring your kid in, they're very vulnerable, they're drinking, they're taking drugs, and the person they lash out at is the mom or the grandma. And this, so much of what we call, I think it's a bad name. I don't think it should have been called elder abuse because one, nobody thinks of themselves as old. I mean, am I an elder? Are you an elder? You know, and nobody, I even was interviewing people who had gone to an elder abuse social worker. They were being treated in an elder abuse service center. Not once did they describe their adult children's aggressive behavior to them as abuse. They said it was bothersome, it was disrespectful. We don't want to see our kids as perpetrators. We don't want to see them as abusive. And so we have how many people are living in fear of their own kids, but that afraid to, you don't want your kids arrested. You don't want your neighbors to know. If you have to call the police and they come in front of your house to let them know that your own child has attacked you, this is the worst shame. And people don't, really resist seeking help because it feels so shameful to have a child who is not able to control themselves and is actually attacking their own mother or grandmother.
I think one of the myths, certainly that's perpetrated, is that this type of behavior does not happen in Jewish families. Is that a true statement, or is it a myth?
I know Jewish families have come to me. It's definitely a myth. But I think in terms of community shame, family shame, in all communities, people do not want to speak up. And it's part of that idea of Jewish people don't do this is nobody believes that their kids do this. And this is why it's so hard and why it's so difficult, is because there's so much silence. And when you keep being silent, especially if you're in a situation where your adult child is aggressive, and if you're isolated, many people stop talking. They don't want to tell their brother and sister because all their brother and sister does is, well, you should have kicked him out. You should have stopped the money. You should have done this. And you don't want to tell your friends because everybody has advice. Everybody wants to say, why didn't you? I told you to kick him out last week. And so people stop talking. They get more and more isolated. And then it becomes like a tinderbox, that the aggression, there's nobody there to know. There's no eyes on the situation. And it's very, very dangerous.
We're speaking with Dr. Judith Smith, the author of Mothering Challenging Adult Children Through Conflict and Change. Available, I would imagine, Dr. Smith, at all the usual outlets, bookstores and Amazon.
Mostly online.
Where do you...
And also in your libraries. If you don't have it in your library, ask your library to get it for you. A good point, and another point that I wanted to ask. Well, if I'm living this situation that you're describing, where do I go? If I'm filled with shame because I don't want everybody to know. If I'm a member of a synagogue, I'm not sure I want to talk about this even with the rabbi, although maybe, but certainly not with where do I go? The Jewish Family and Children's Service. I may not have a therapist. Where do I go to get help? Well, the very first step, first of all, I think rabbis, I know in my synagogue, I gave a talk. This is during COVID. And usually when they did this, they get 15, 20 people would sign up. They had 150 people from the congregation, and we have a very big congregation, sign up. They were shocked at how many people. And they wanted to form a support group, but they haven't because of the shame. I mean, people won't come to the group. But if you're listening to this right now and you are in danger, the first thing to do is call 988, which is the national helpline. And you explain to them your situation, where you live, and they will connect you to the senior services in your area. Or you can look online for the state senior services in your area, explain to them that you are feeling frightened of your daughter or son. Where do you get help? And if the first person who talks to you isn't very helpful, call back. This is a really good service. If you keep pushing to get the right person, they will help connect you to the local
services. So that number is 988. And I know from our area and down in southern New Jersey, the Jewish Family and Children's Service has a huge program around this, very confidential. And depending upon where you live, not everybody lives in an area with a highly functioning JFCS. But if you have one locally, that is also another resource that you can go to. You write about, you talk about launching, and you had this very, very interesting quote from the beginning of the book on autonomy. So I just want to ask you to sort of like reflect on this. You write, quote, "The markers of independence, of whether a child achieves autonomy early, late, or on time, are not as rigid as they once were," unquote. Talk to me about what you mean by that.
Well, currently, we have the highest rates of young adults living with their parents. It used to be, after the war in the 50s and the 60s, kids would go. You didn't stay home living with mama and papa. You went. Now, because of the high cost of rent, the high cost of graduate school, many, many young people are still living at home because they can't afford to move out. So you don't necessarily, I was being interviewed by a young reporter the other day, and she was about 20. And she said, well, I'm still living with my parents. Am I a difficult adult child? This is no longer a marker of being independent if you're still living with your family. If you're living with your family and aren't making friends and aren't socializing and only following your parents' life, there probably is a problem. But when I'm talking about a difficult adult child, it's someone who really doesn't have the inner resources to hold a job, to have a good, successful relationship. Or people with serious mental illness, if they are taking medication, can get work, can have relationships. So there's a key issue about staying on medication and getting medication, but it's very hard for people who have mental illness to really believe that the medication is going to help. And if you have a substance use issue, treatment can help, but there's not enough affordable, good treatment
that
centers.
goes to a whole other conversation on the inequality of access to so many things that people need in this country right now. But that is an ongoing issue that we raise, and I'm sure you deal with professionally as well. You also, and I'll because we're going to run out of time soon, but I do want you to just speak very quickly about, towards the end, you do include a sort of like this idea of helping yourself. You mentioned social support, self-care, being safe at home, and helping an adult child. That's your 4 points of really under this rubric of how to help yourself, correct?
That's right. Well, so the book is divided into 3 parts. At first, it's really stories from which I learned, what is a difficult adult child? What are the different feelings parents experience when they're in this situation? And then the second part is beginning to think about how ready you are to make some changes. The changes have to be with you. You can't go and get your kid to stop taking medication. If you could, they'd be on the drugs, they'd be in treatment. Our power as mothers and fathers diminishes once we have adult kids. So what you can begin to change is yourself. And we're not talking about huge changes, but you can begin to change how reactive you are with your adult child. And you can begin to start building your own life. I think what happens when parents are so frightened of what's going to happen to my daughter, what's going to happen to my son, that you don't have the psychological and emotional space to take care of yourself. Many mothers reported to me they hadn't gone to a doctor in 2 years. They hadn't done basic things for themselves. And research has shown, let's say self-care, we're not talking about taking bubble baths. We're talking about doing, basic exercise, and also like taking a walk. Taking a walk can really help you with your depression. But they have found that if you take a walk with your neighbor, you become less depressed. So we need people and we need to exercise. And I think social support, finding people who are in this situation to talk to. This is too low. What every mother I meet talks to me about is the loneliness. Because you stop talking to anyone, you feel like you're a bad mother, you have a bad kid, and your world starts closing in on you. So you have to start talking to other people. And really finding a group is, first you want to find maybe a therapist for yourself or a social worker who can help you steer this. And if you're in physical danger, they'll help you set up a safety plan. If you have an aggressive child, you need to have a safety plan that if things get out of control, you need to have a bag ready to leave. You need to have a cell phone you could take with you. You need to stay safe. But joining a formal group, and National Association of Mental Illness is located everywhere in the United States. They have excellent family-to-family groups where you can meet other parents and get information about yourself, for yourself. There's also Al-Anon for parents who have substance use disorders, which is free. And they have parent groups within Al-Anon. And then there are private people like myself who offer support groups. But you need to create a new world because we often assume as we get older that our family is going to be our main support. But when you're in this situation, your family is no longer necessarily the best support. You want to start using more what we call weak ties or formal groups. And some people say, I don't want to talk to strangers about all this. But that's who you do want to talk to. Because right now, your closest people are not available to help you with this.
Dr. Judith Smith, the author of Difficult Mothering Challenging Adult Children Through Conflict and Change. Thank you very, very much for this conversation. Very difficult, very powerful, sadly still very, very timely. So thank you. Continued success. Stay healthy. Be careful of the LIE.
Thank you.
And,
right.
And just, thank you very much for your time. To all of you, we appreciate your time with us today. We are very grateful for it. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to have a comment about any of the programs or suggestions for our Seekers of Meaning, just email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. Visit the website, jewishsacredaging.com. If you'd like to support our work in these podcasts, there is a conveniently located donate button on the website, and we appreciate your support. Seekers of Meaning is produced at the Media Centers of Lubetkin Media in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and a shout out to our producer, Steve Lubet. Thank you for joining us. I am your host, Rabbi Richard Address, and until we see each other again, please take care of yourself, stay healthy, and be kind to one another. Shalom.